The space station called Nexus Prime was bigger than most moons. It floated in the empty space between star systems, far from any single world's control. Today, it hosted the most important meeting in the galaxy. Representatives from 67 different alien races had come here for the annual Strategic Defense Summit. Each species brought their best military minds and their finest technology. The main assembly hall was a massive dome made of clear crystal. Through its walls, delegates could see the stars spinning slowly as the station rotated. Inside, the air was carefully controlled to support dozens of different life forms. Some beings breathed oxygen like humans. Others needed methane or helium. The station's computers worked constantly to keep everyone alive and comfortable. Dr. Marcus Webb sat alone in the human section. His chair was small compared to the massive seats built for the 8-foot-tall Cretarians or the floating platforms used by the gas-breathing Zelons. Webb was a thin man in his 50s, with gray hair and simple clothes. He carried only a basic tablet computer and a worn leather notebook. Compared to the other delegates, with their glowing holographic displays and floating assistants, he looked very ordinary. Webb watched as the other species mingled before the meeting started. The Altarians moved in perfect formation, their blue skin gleaming under the hall's lights. They were known as the galaxy's finest warriors and strategists. Their military academies had trained soldiers for over 10,000 years. The Zephyrians floated nearby, their crystal bodies chiming softly as they communicated through sound waves that most species couldn't hear. Near the center of the hall, the Galactic Council's inner circle took their places. These were representatives from the 12 oldest and most powerful civilizations. They made the real decisions about galactic defense. The other species, including humanity, were only allowed to watch and listen. Commander Sarah Chen stood among the Altarian delegation. She was tall and proud, with the traditional blue markings on her forehead that showed her rank. Chen had fought in 17 major battles and won them all. She had written 3 books about military strategy that were studied in war colleges across 50 different worlds. At 43 years old, she was young for her position, but her mind was sharp as a laser blade. Chen's eyes found Webb sitting alone. She whispered something to her aide, and both Altarians looked at the human with barely hidden disgust. Chen had read Earth's file when humanity was first contacted 3 years ago. What she found there made her laugh. Humans lived less than 100 years. They had never left their own planet until recently. Their entire recorded history was only a few thousand years long. Most shocking of all, they had never fought anyone except themselves. "Look at him," Chen said to her aide. "Earth's great representative. They send us a scientist when we're discussing military matters. Do they think this is a research conference?" Her aide smiled. Perhaps they don't understand what war actually means. Their conflicts were so small, a few million soldiers at most. We've had single battles with more warriors than that. Webb seemed to sense their attention. He looked up from his notebook and nodded politely at Chen. She turned away without responding. The gesture was clear to everyone watching. The humans were beneath her notice. The meeting began with great ceremony. Admiral Vextar of the Draconian Empire called for order with a voice that rumbled like thunder. He was over 9 feet tall, with dark scales and glowing red eyes. Behind him, a holographic display showed the current state of galactic defense. Green dots marked protected systems. Yellow showed areas under surveillance. Red indicated trouble zones. "Fellow beings," Vextar announced, "we gather today facing our greatest challenge yet. The Void Swarm continues to grow stronger. In the past year, they have consumed 12 star systems. Our best scientists cannot predict where they will strike next. Our finest generals cannot find a way to stop them." The hall grew quiet. The Void Swarm was a mystery that terrified every civilization. They appeared without warning, consumed everything in their path, and vanished just as quickly. No one knew what they wanted or where they came from. Ships that tried to fight them simply disappeared. Planets in their path became empty rocks floating in space. General Thax of the Cronarian military spoke next. His 4 arms gestured at detailed battle plans floating above the assembly. We have analyzed every attack. The swarm uses advanced technology and superior numbers. Our current strategy of fleet engagement has failed repeatedly. We must consider new approaches. Several delegates offered suggestions. The Altarians proposed larger battle formations with better coordination. The Xelons suggested new shield technologies. The Zephyrians wanted to study swarm energy signatures to predict their movements. Each idea was carefully discussed and analyzed by the galaxy's greatest minds. Webb listened to it all without saying a word. He took notes in his simple notebook, using an actual pen made of metal and plastic. The other delegates used holographic displays that responded to thought alone, but Webb preferred writing by hand. It helped him think. Commander Chen watched him scribble in his notebook and felt irritated. What could a primitive human possibly understand about galactic warfare? His species had barely learned to fly between planets. They knew nothing about real military strategy. Their biggest wars involved a few hundred aircraft and some metal vehicles that moved on wheels. It was like watching a child play with toys while adults discussed serious matters. As the day wore on, Webb remained silent. When asked directly if Earth had any contributions to make, he simply said, "We're still learning about the scope of the problem." This made several delegates chuckle. The humans were clearly out of their depth. But Webb wasn't just listening to the presentations. He was studying the speakers themselves. He watched how they moved, how they thought, how they approached problems. What he saw worried him more than the void swarm itself. These civilizations had grown soft. They fought their wars like chess games, following rules and patterns that hadn't changed in thousands of years. Webb had spent his life studying something no other species possessed, the complete military history of a world at war with itself. While other civilizations had conquered primitive neighbors or fought rare formal conflicts against equals, humanity had been forged in constant battle. For thousands of years, humans had fought humans, using every trick, strategy, and innovation they could imagine. As the meeting continued into the evening, Webb closed his notebook. Tomorrow would bring new discussions about the void swarm. But tonight, he had work to do. He needed to understand his enemy better than anyone else in this hall, because he was beginning to suspect that everything these advanced civilizations knew about war was exactly what the void swarm expected them to know. The truth was coming, and it would change everything. The second day of the Strategic Defense Summit began with grim news. During the night, long-range sensors had detected void swarm activity near the Meridian sector. 3 mining colonies had gone silent. The usual pattern was emerging. Complete communication blackout, followed by empty space where thriving worlds used to be. Admiral Vextar stood before the assembled delegates, his scaled face darker than usual. The situation grows worse each day. Our fleets cannot match their speed. Our technology cannot penetrate their defenses. We need new ideas, no matter how radical they might seem. Commander Chen sat in the front row with the other senior military officers. She had spent the night reviewing battle reports and tactical analyses. Every approach the galactic civilizations had tried followed the same pattern. Organize large fleets, establish battle lines, engage with maximum firepower. It was the way warfare had been conducted for thousands of years, across hundreds of worlds. It was civilized, logical, and completely ineffective against the void swarm. Perhaps we should consider unconventional approaches, suggested General Thax. His 4 arms spread wide as he gestured to the holographic display. The enemy clearly expects traditional fleet formations. We must surprise them somehow. Several delegates offered modifications to existing strategies. The Draconian Empire proposed faster ships. The Crystal Confederacy suggested new weapon designs. Each idea was a variation on the same theme: use superior technology and overwhelming force to achieve victory. Dr. Webb had been silent during the morning session, but now he raised his hand slowly. The gesture was so unusual that conversations around the hall stopped. Admiral Vextar looked surprised, but nodded for the human to speak. Webb stood up carefully. His simple clothes and worn notebook made him look even smaller in the Grand Assembly Hall. Admiral, with respect, I think we're approaching this problem incorrectly. A few delegates whispered among themselves. The Altarian section buzzed with quiet laughter. Commander Chen felt her jaw tighten. What could this primitive human possibly contribute to a discussion between the galaxy's finest military minds? Please continue, Dr. Webb, Admiral Vextar said politely. Webb looked down at his notebook, then back at the assembly. Every strategy we've discussed assumes we should fight the Void Swarm using conventional warfare. Large fleets, organized battles, predictable formations. But what if that's exactly what they expect us to do? General Thax's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting we abandon proven military doctrine? I'm suggesting we consider something my people call guerrilla tactics, Webb replied. Small groups, unexpected attacks, hit-and-run strategies. Make ourselves unpredictable. The hall erupted in confused murmurs. Most species had never heard the term guerrilla warfare before. Their translators struggled with the concept because no galactic civilization had ever needed such tactics. Commander Chen saw her opportunity. She stood up slowly, her tall frame commanding attention. Admiral, with your permission, I would like to address this suggestion. Vextar nodded, though he looked uncertain about where this was heading. Chen's voice carried clearly through the hall as she began to speak. Dr. Webb, I appreciate that your species wants to contribute to this discussion, but perhaps you don't understand the scale of what we're facing here. She activated her personal holographic display, showing images of massive galactic fleet formations. These are real military forces, Doctor. Ships that can destroy planets. Weapons that can tear holes in space itself. Soldiers who have trained for decades in the finest military academies in the galaxy. The images shifted to show battle footage from previous conflicts. Thousands of ships moving in perfect formation, unleashing devastating firepower in coordinated strikes. This is how civilized warfare is conducted, Dr. Webb, with discipline, strategy, and overwhelming technological superiority. Chen's voice grew sharper as she continued. Now you suggest we abandon all of this for what? Guerrilla tactics? She pronounced the words like they tasted bad. Small groups running around randomly, hit-and-run attacks? She turned to face Webb directly, her blue skin gleaming under the lights. Dr. Webb, your species has existed for what, a few thousand years? Your entire recorded history could fit in a single semester at our military academies. You have never fought anyone except yourselves, using primitive weapons and tiny armies. Laughter began to ripple through the hall as other delegates realized what Chen was doing. She pressed her advantage, her voice rising with confidence. Your people fought with metal vehicles that rolled on the ground. Your aircraft were powered by burning chemicals. Your largest battles involved perhaps a few million soldiers. Chen gestured toward the holographic displays showing galactic fleet formations. We have single battle groups with more firepower than your entire planet possessed throughout its entire history. The laughter grew louder. Several delegates were now openly chuckling at Webb, who stood silently taking the abuse. Chen felt a surge of satisfaction as she delivered what she intended to be the killing blow. And now, faced with a threat that has baffled the greatest military minds in galactic history, you suggest we adopt the tactics of cave dwellers? The strategies of primitives who knew nothing about real warfare? Chen's voice dripped with disdain. Dr. Webb, your species has barely learned to leave their own planet. What could you possibly understand about galactic-scale military operations? She turned back to the assembly, spreading her arms wide. Fellow delegates, we are discussing the defense of entire civilizations. Billions of lives hang in the balance. Are we really going to consider advice from a species whose greatest military achievement was learning to fly between their own cities? The hall erupted in applause and laughter. Delegates from dozens of species joined in mocking the human representative. The Cretarians stamped their feet in appreciation. The Zelons created harmonious sounds of agreement. Even the normally serious Draconians allowed themselves to smile at Chen's verbal destruction of the primitive human. Perhaps, Chen continued with a theatrical pause, Dr. Webb's people should focus on learning basic spaceflight before they attempt to teach the galaxy how to conduct warfare. We appreciate your enthusiasm, Doctor, but this is a discussion for species who understand what real military power looks like. She sat down to thunderous applause. Several delegates actually stood up to show their appreciation for her speech. The message was clear. Humanity had been put in its proper place. Dr. Webb remained standing throughout the applause. He didn't try to defend himself or argue back. He simply waited for the laughter to die down, then quietly sat back in his chair. He opened his notebook and wrote something down with his primitive pen. Admiral Vextar cleared his throat and tried to restore order. Thank you, Commander Chen, for that thorough analysis. Perhaps we should return to discussing more conventional approaches to the Void Swarm problem. Word of the humans' humiliation spread quickly through the station's corridors. By evening, delegates from across the galaxy were repeating Chen's speech and laughing about the primitive human who thought cave-dweller tactics could save galactic civilization. Webb spent that evening alone in his quarters, writing in his notebook. He wasn't angry about Chen's attack. He understood her perspective completely. From where she stood, everything she had said was logical and correct. Humanity was young, inexperienced, and primitive compared to the great galactic civilizations. What Chen didn't understand was that sometimes being primitive was exactly what the situation required. But Webb knew that trying to explain this would only invite more mockery. Instead, he would wait. The truth had a way of revealing itself when it mattered most. And Webb had a feeling that moment was coming soon. The alarm started as a low hum that most delegates barely noticed. Dr. Webb was in his quarters, reviewing his notes from the day's humiliation, when the sound began. At first, he thought it might be a maintenance cycle or a routine system check. Nexus Prime was a massive station with thousands of automated processes running constantly. But the hum grew louder and more urgent. Within minutes, it became a wailing siren that echoed through every corridor on the station. Webb's door chimed, and a mechanical voice announced in perfect standard galactic. All delegates report to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Webb grabbed his notebook and hurried toward the assembly hall. The corridors were filled with confused delegates from dozens of species, all moving in the same direction. The Altarians moved in their typical organized formations, while the gas-breathing Zelons floated in perfect geometric patterns. Even in crisis, each species maintained their cultural approaches to order and discipline. The assembly hall had been transformed into a command center. Holographic displays filled the air above the delegates' heads, showing sensor readings, fleet positions, and tactical data streams. Admiral Vextar stood at the center of it all, his scaled face grim as he studied the incoming reports. The Void Swarm has been detected in this sector, Vextar announced as the last delegates arrived. Long-range sensors show a massive formation approaching our position. Estimated arrival time, 6 hours. A chill ran through the hall. The Void Swarm had never attacked a major installation like Nexus Prime before. They had focused on isolated colonies and mining operations. But now they were coming for the heart of Galactic Military Command. Commander Chen stepped forward, her military training taking over. Admiral, what defensive assets do we have available? Vextar activated a tactical display that showed the space around Nexus Prime. The Third Fleet is stationed here for summit security. 47 ships, including 8 heavy cruisers and 3 dreadnoughts. Additional forces are being called in from nearby sectors, but they won't arrive for 12 hours. 47 ships should be sufficient, declared General Thax. The Void Swarm has never faced a concentrated battle group of this quality. Our weapons are the finest in the galaxy. Other military leaders agreed. The ships defending Nexus Prime represented the best technology from a dozen different civilizations. Their crews had trained together for years. Their weapons could level entire planets. Against any conventional enemy, they would have been an unstoppable force. Webb watched the tactical displays with growing concern. The approaching Void Swarm formation was huge, but that wasn't what worried him. What worried him was how confident everyone seemed about fighting them. Battle groups Alpha through Delta will establish a defensive perimeter here, Shen announced, pointing to positions around the station. We'll use the Meridian formation to maximize our firepower coverage. Standard engagement protocols will apply. The Meridian formation was a classic galactic military strategy. Ships arranged in geometric patterns that allowed each vessel to support the others while maintaining clear firing lines. It had been used successfully for thousands of years against every conceivable enemy. The formation was taught in every military academy and practiced by every fleet in the galaxy. As the hours passed, Webb watched the preparations with a growing sense of dread. Every decision the military leaders made followed established doctrine. Every strategy they employed had been tested in hundreds of previous conflicts. Everything they were doing was logical, proven, and completely predictable. The Void Swarm arrived exactly on schedule. The first sensor contacts appeared at the edge of detection range, moving faster than anything in the galactic databases. They approached in loose groups that seemed to have no clear pattern or formation. Enemy contacts confirmed, reported the sensor officer. Count is difficult to establish. They appear to be using some form of stealth technology. Admiral Vextar studied the displays with experienced eyes. All ships to battle stations. Engage when they enter effective weapons range. The defending fleet moved into position with military precision. Each ship knew exactly where to go and what to do. The Alterian vessels took point positions, their blue hulls gleaming in the starlight. Behind them, the massive Draconian dreadnoughts prepared their planet-killing weapons. Crystal ships from the Xelon Confederation added their energy shields to the formation's defenses. Webb found himself standing next to Commander Chen as they watched the battle develop. She noticed him, but didn't speak. After yesterday's public humiliation, she clearly considered the human beneath her notice. "Contact!" shouted the communications officer. Void Swarm units are engaging the outer perimeter. The main display filled with images from the battle. The defending ships opened fire with devastating precision. Energy beams that could slice through asteroids lanced out toward the approaching enemies. Missile salvos that could destroy cities erupted from launch tubes. The firepower display was awesome to behold. For a few minutes, it looked like the defense might succeed. Void Swarm units exploded under the concentrated assault. The geometric precision of the Meridian formation allowed the defenders to focus their fire exactly where it would be most effective. But then, something strange began to happen. The Void Swarm units that were destroyed seemed to have been expendable. Behind them, larger formations moved in patterns that made no tactical sense. They ignored optimal firing positions and bypassed opportunities to attack damaged ships. "They're not following any recognized combat doctrine," muttered General Thax, his forearms moving frantically over his control displays. "Their movements are completely random." "Not random," Webb said quietly. "Adaptive." Chen glanced at him with irritation. "What did you say?" They're adapting to your formation, Webb explained. Every shot you fire gives them information about your weapon's range and power. Every movement tells them about your ship capabilities. They're learning. Impossible, Chen snapped. No enemy force can adapt that quickly to established military doctrine. But even as she spoke, the truth was becoming obvious on the tactical displays. The Void Swarm had figured out the Meridian formation's weaknesses. They began attacking from angles that the geometric pattern couldn't cover effectively. They used small, fast units to probe defensive positions while keeping their main force hidden. They're using our own formation against us, Admiral Vexstar said with growing alarm. Somehow they've identified the blind spots in our coverage. The battle began to turn against the defenders. Void Swarm units appeared where they weren't expected, struck at weak points, then vanished before the defending ships could respond. The precise formations that had worked for thousands of years became death traps, as the enemy exploited every predictable movement. Adapt Formation Gamma, ordered Chen. Increase spacing between ships. But Formation Gamma had its own weaknesses, and the Void Swarm found them just as quickly. Within an hour, 3 defending ships had been destroyed, and 2 more were badly damaged. The enemy seemed to anticipate every tactical adjustment the defenders made. Webb watched it all with sick fascination. The galactic civilizations were fighting exactly the way their military academies had taught them. Every move followed established doctrine. Every formation came from approved tactical manuals, and every decision was being countered by an enemy that didn't fight like anything they had ever faced before. We need to withdraw to the secondary perimeter, General Thax announced reluctantly. Regroup and reassess our strategy. But even the withdrawal followed standard protocols. Ships pulled back in organized patterns, maintaining formation discipline even as the enemy pressed their advantage. The Void Swarm seemed to know exactly how the retreat would be conducted, and position themselves to maximize the damage. By the time the surviving defenders reached the inner defensive line around Nexus Prime itself, half the fleet had been destroyed or disabled. The station's own defensive systems engaged, adding their firepower to the fight. But even these massive weapons followed predictable patterns that the enemy quickly learned to avoid. This is impossible, Chen said, staring at the tactical displays in disbelief. We'd have superior technology, better training, more experience. How are they defeating us? Webb looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. Commander, you've been fighting the same kinds of enemies for thousands of years. Your tactics work perfectly against opponents who think the way you do. But the Void Swarm doesn't think like you. Then how do they think? She demanded. Webb was quiet for a moment, watching another defending ship explode on the display. They think like something that's been fighting enemies who refuse to be predictable. They think like something that's learned to expect the unexpected. The station shuddered as Void Swarm weapons began to strike its outer hull. Emergency lights flickered throughout the assembly hall. For the first time in galactic history, the heart of military command was under direct attack. And the defenders were losing. The emergency lights cast red shadows across the assembly hall as Nexus Prime shuddered under another direct hit. Half the defending fleet was gone, and the remaining ships were falling back to the station's final defensive perimeter. On the tactical displays, the Void Swarm forces moved in patterns that made no sense to anyone trained in galactic military doctrine. Admiral Vexstar's scaled hands trembled as he studied the battle reports. Prepare for evacuation protocols. We cannot hold this position. Commander Chen felt something breaking inside her chest. Her entire life had been built around the certainty that superior training and technology would always triumph. The Altarian military had never lost a major engagement. Their strategies were studied throughout the galaxy, and now they were being destroyed by an enemy that refused to follow any recognizable combat patterns. There has to be something we're missing, she said desperately. Some weakness we haven't identified. Dr. Webb had been silent since the battle began, watching the displays with an expression that was hard to read. Now he closed his notebook and stood up slowly. "Admiral, may I have permission to speak?" Vextar looked surprised. In the chaos of battle, he had almost forgotten about the human representative. "Dr. Webb, unless you have tactical information that might help us, I'm afraid—" "I do have tactical information," Webb interrupted quietly. "But first, I need to tell you something that isn't in Earth's official files." The hall grew quieter as delegates turned to listen. Even with the station under attack, there was something in Webb's voice that commanded attention. "My name is Dr. Marcus Webb, and I'm listed in your records as a scientist and historian. That's true, but it's not the whole truth." Webb looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of beings who had mocked him just days before. "I'm also Colonel Marcus Webb, retired, of the Earth Confederate Military Intelligence Division." Chen felt her blood turn cold. Military intelligence meant he was a spy, an analyst of enemy capabilities and weaknesses. But that made no sense. Earth had no enemies except themselves. Webb continued, his voice carrying clearly despite the alarms echoing through the station. "For the past 30 years, I've studied something that no other species in this hall possesses. A complete record of warfare between technologically equal opponents." He activated his simple tablet computer, and basic holographic displays appeared above it. They showed images from Earth's history. Vast battles, burning cities, soldiers fighting in conditions that made the current crisis look organized by comparison. Every species in this galaxy became dominant by conquering primitive neighbors. The Altarians defeated Stone Age civilizations. The Draconians conquered worlds that barely had metal tools. You've all fought wars against inferior opponents for thousands of years. General Thax's forearms moved restlessly. "What's your point, Doctor?" "My point is that humanity is the only species that has spent its entire history fighting itself. For 5,000 years we have battled opponents with the same technology, the same intelligence, the same capacity for innovation that we possess." Webb gestured toward the tactical displays showing the current battle. "You've all perfected the art of war against enemies who couldn't match your capabilities. We perfected the art of war against enemies who could match everything we threw at them." The station shuddered again as Void Swarm weapons found their target. Emergency crews rushed past the assembly hall's entrance, heading toward damaged sections. "Webb," Chen said carefully, "even if that's true, your people's conflicts were tiny compared to this. A few million soldiers, primitive weapons." "Scale doesn't matter," Webb replied. "What matters is that our enemies could think. They could adapt. They could learn from our tactics and develop counters. Every strategy we created, our opponents found ways to defeat. Every formation we used, they learned to break." He touched his tablet again, and new images appeared. These showed military concepts that had no translation in galactic languages. Ambush tactics, false retreats, sacrificial attacks designed to mislead rather than destroy. "You've been fighting the Void Swarm the way you've always fought everyone else. Organized formations, overwhelming firepower, technological superiority. But they're not primitive cave dwellers who will run when you show them your superior weapons." Admiral Vextar studied the strange human tactical concepts with growing interest. "What are you suggesting we do differently?" Webb looked around the hall one more time. "I'm suggesting we fight like humans. Unpredictably, irrationally, using tactics that make no sense to a logical military mind." "That's insane," Chen protested. "Military doctrine exists for good reasons. Formations and protocols have been tested." "Against predictable enemies," Webb interrupted. "Commander, the Void Swarm is beating you because they've figured out your patterns. Every formation you use, every strategy you employ, follows rules they can learn and counter. Another explosion shook the station. Through the crystal dome above them, delegates could see Void Swarm ships moving closer to Nexus Prime itself. Webb activated more displays from his tablet. Look at this battle from Earth's history. Two armies, with identical equipment, face each other. The logical strategy would be to form lines and engage with maximum firepower. The hologram showed exactly that. Organized troops, in neat formations, exchanging devastating volleys of gunfire. But watch what actually happened. The display shifted to show chaos. Soldiers breaking formation, attacking from unexpected angles, using tactics that seemed to make no military sense. The side that won was the one that made their enemies' preparations useless by refusing to fight the expected battle. General Thax leaned forward, his military mind beginning to grasp what Webb was describing. You're talking about deliberately creating disorder in your own forces. I'm talking about controlled chaos, Webb corrected. Making your moves unpredictable enough that the enemy can't counter them, but coordinated enough that you don't destroy yourself. Chen felt everything she believed about warfare crumbling around her. But how do you coordinate forces that are acting randomly? Webb smiled grimly. You don't coordinate the tactics, you coordinate the objectives. Tell each unit what you want them to achieve, but let them figure out how to do it. The result looks like chaos to an outside observer, but it's actually dozens of independent solutions working toward the same goal. The tactical displays showed another defending ship being destroyed. The remaining fleet was down to less than a dozen vessels, and the station's shields were failing under the constant assault. Admiral Vextar made a decision that went against everything he had learned in his long military career. Webb, what exactly are you proposing? Webb stood straighter, and for the first time since arriving at Nexus Prime, he looked like the military officer he actually was. Give me command of the remaining ships. Let me show you how humans fight when they're facing an enemy that can think. The request was shocking. Put a primitive human in command of the galaxy's finest remaining warships? It went against every protocol, every tradition, every rational military principle. But rational military principles were getting them all killed. Chen found herself speaking before she realized what she was doing. Admiral, our current strategies aren't working. Maybe it's time to try something that doesn't make sense. Webb looked at her with something like respect. Commander, I need to warn you about something. The way humans fight war, it's not civilized. We don't follow rules of honor or conduct. We don't preserve our forces or minimize casualties. When we fight for survival, we fight to win by any means necessary. He paused, letting that sink in. Ma'am, we didn't become civilized and then learn to wage war. We learned to weaponize our lack of civilization. The station shuddered again, and this time the lights flickered and stayed dim. The Void Swarm was preparing for their final assault. Admiral Vextar looked around the hall, at faces filled with desperation and dying hope. Then he looked back at the quiet human who had been mocked and dismissed just days before. Colonel Webb, he said formally, I'm placing you in tactical command of all remaining defensive forces. Show us how humanity fights. Webb nodded once, then moved toward the command station. As he passed Commander Chen, he stopped and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. Commander, you said my people's wars were small and primitive. You were right about the scale, but you were wrong about them being primitive. His voice was calm and certain. We've been fighting total war against equals for 5,000 years. The Void Swarm is about to learn what that really means. Colonel Webb moved to the command station with the confidence of someone who had been waiting his entire life for this moment. The remaining ship captains appeared on communication screens around him, their faces showing mixtures of desperation and disbelief. 11 ships. That's all that remained of the galaxy's finest defensive fleet. All vessels, this is Colonel Webb. I'm assuming tactical command by order of Admiral Vextar. His voice was calm and steady, completely different from the quiet scientist who had been mocked days earlier. I need to know the current status of each ship immediately. The reports came in quickly. Most of the surviving vessels were damaged, but still functional. Their crews were experienced professionals who knew their equipment perfectly. Under normal circumstances, they would have been a formidable force. But these weren't normal circumstances. Webb studied the tactical display, showing the Void Swarm's positions. They had arranged themselves in a loose formation around Nexus Prime, clearly preparing for a final assault. Their movements showed the same adaptive intelligence that had destroyed the previous defenders. The Captain Thekvar of the Altarian cruiser Starfire, Webb called to one of the communication screens. I need you to do something that's going to seem completely insane. The Altarian captain's blue face showed confusion. Sir, what are your orders? Break formation completely. Take your ship and start running directly away from the station, full speed, and make sure the enemy can track you easily. Every military officer in the assembly hall stared at Webb in shock. Commander Chen felt her heart sink. Colonel, you're ordering him to abandon the defense? Captain Thekvar, Webb continued, ignoring Chen's protest. When the enemy follows you, I want you to suddenly reverse course and attack the largest Void Swarm ship you can find. Use everything you have, every weapon, every missile. Make it look like you're trying to ram them. Sir, that's suicide, the captain protested. It's supposed to look like suicide, Webb replied, but at the last second, I want you to veer off and retreat again. Make them think you lost your nerve. Webb turned to another screen. Captain Mordoon of the Draconian heavy cruiser, Flame of Conquest. You're going to take your ship and hide behind Nexus Prime's moon. Power down everything except life support. Make yourself invisible. Colonel, Admiral Vextar interrupted, you're splitting our forces and eliminating our firepower concentration. This goes against every principle of defensive warfare. Webb looked up from the tactical display. Admiral, respectfully, every principle of defensive warfare just got half your fleet killed. The Void Swarm has learned to counter organized resistance. Time to show them something they've never seen before. He turned back to the communication screens. Captain Zexara of the Crystal Ship Harmony, you're going to position yourself between two Void Swarm formations and start broadcasting on all frequencies simultaneously. I don't care what you broadcast. Music, poetry, technical manuals, just flood their communications with noise. Sir, that will make coordination with our other ships impossible, the captain pointed out. Exactly, Webb replied. We're not going to coordinate in any way they can understand. For the next 10 minutes, Webb gave orders that violated every military principle known to galactic civilization. Ships were told to act independently. Formations were deliberately broken. Captains were given contradictory objectives and told to improvise solutions. Commander Chen watched in growing horror as the organized defense fell apart completely. Colonel, you're creating chaos. How is this supposed to defeat the enemy? Webb turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her step back. Commander, chaos is exactly what I'm creating. The Void Swarm has learned to predict organized behavior. They can't predict random behavior. On the tactical display, the human strategy began to unfold. Captain Thekvar's ship shot away from the station at maximum speed, leaving the defense formation completely exposed. Just as Webb had predicted, several Void Swarm units broke off to pursue the apparently fleeing vessel. But then, Thekvar suddenly reversed course and charged directly at the largest swarm ship. His weapons blazed at maximum power, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to ram the enemy vessel. At the last possible second, he veered away and fled again. The Void Swarm's response was visible on the sensors. Their formation wavered as they tried to process what they had just seen. The action made no tactical sense. It achieved no strategic objective. It was simply random. "They're confused," Webb said with satisfaction. "They're trying to analyze Thekvar's behavior to predict his next move, but there is no pattern to predict." Meanwhile, Captain Mordun had hidden his massive dreadnought behind Nexus Prime's moon and gone completely silent. The Void Swarm ships moved past his position without detecting him. When 3 enemy vessels entered his firing arc, he suddenly powered up and unleashed a devastating broadside attack from point-blank range. Before the other swarm ships could respond, he was gone again, disappearing behind a different asteroid. "Now they have to worry about invisible enemies," Webb explained to a stunned assembly. "They can't focus all their attention on the obvious threats." Captain Zexara's crystal ship was broadcasting everything from ancient Altarian war songs to draconian engineering manuals on every frequency simultaneously. The communication jamming made it impossible for any ship to coordinate with the others, but it also made it impossible for the Void Swarm to predict what anyone would do next. The enemy formation began to lose cohesion as individual swarm ships tried to respond to threats that appeared and disappeared without warning. They had learned to counter organized military doctrine, but they had no framework for dealing with organized chaos. Webb activated his communicator to address all remaining ships simultaneously. "All captains, new orders. Attack any target of opportunity with any weapons you choose. Retreat when you feel like it. Advance when you want to. The only rule is that there are no rules." "Sir," protested one captain, "how do we achieve tactical coordination without orders?" "You don't," Webb replied. "That's the point. Each of you decides independently how to hurt the enemy. Just hurt them in whatever way seems most effective to you personally." The result was something no military academy in the galaxy had ever imagined. 11 ships moving in completely unpredictable patterns, attacking without coordination, retreating without orders. It looked like total chaos, and it was destroying the Void Swarm. The enemy ships kept trying to respond to threats that no longer existed by the time they could react. They attempted to predict attack patterns that had no pattern. They tried to counter strategies that changed completely from moment to moment. Captain Thekvar would charge an enemy formation, fire a few shots, then suddenly break off to help a ship on the opposite side of the battle. Captain Mordoon appeared and disappeared like a ghost, striking from impossible angles. Captain Zexara turned her communication jamming into a weapon, confusing enemy targeting systems with false signals. Commander Chen watched it all with a mixture of amazement and terror. "They're winning," she whispered. "It's completely insane, but they're actually winning." Webb nodded grimly. "Commander, the Void Swarm learned to fight the galaxy's most organized military forces, but they never learned to fight something that refuses to be organized." The tide of battle turned decisively when Captain Mordun managed to destroy the largest Void Swarm ship with a perfectly timed ambush. The loss seemed to break something in the enemy's tactical processing. The remaining ships began to withdraw, moving in the same random patterns they had used to attack. But now the unpredictability worked against them. Without coordination, they couldn't cover each other's retreat. The human-style chaos that had confused them during the attack now made them easy targets as they fled. Within 2 hours, the last Void Swarm ship had jumped away from Nexus Prime. The station was saved, the immediate threat was over, and the galaxy's military commanders were staring at each other in stunned silence. Admiral Vextar was the first to speak. "Colonel Webb, what you just did, it violated every principle of military science." Webb closed his notebook and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Admiral, that's exactly why it worked. The Void Swarm had learned to counter military science. They hadn't learned to counter military madness." Commander Chen approached him slowly, her perfect military posture somehow less rigid than before. "Colonel, I owe you an apology. When I spoke yesterday about your people's primitive warfare— You were right, Commander, Webb interrupted gently. Our warfare is primitive. We never learned to fight clean, civilized battles against inferior opponents. We learned to fight dirty, chaotic battles against equals. He looked around the assembly hall at the faces of beings who would never see humanity the same way again. Every species in this galaxy became dominant through superior technology and organization. You learned to wage war like a science. Humanity learned to wage war like an art. Sometimes art beats science. Chen stood at attention and rendered a formal military salute to the human colonel. Sir, what do we do when the Void Swarm returns? Because they will return, and now they'll be expecting chaos instead of organization. Webb smiled, and for the first time since arriving at Nexus Prime, it was the smile of someone who was exactly where he belonged. Commander, that's the beautiful thing about human military doctrine. We don't just have one way to fight chaotically. We have thousands of them. He gestured toward his simple notebook. I've spent 30 years studying every human conflict in our recorded history. Every trick, every strategy, every dirty tactic that one group of humans used to defeat another group of humans with identical capabilities. The hall was completely quiet now, with every delegate hanging on his words. The Void Swarm just learned to expect the unexpected from humanity. But they have no idea how many different kinds of unexpected we can deliver. Commander Chen found herself smiling as well, though it felt strange on her face. Colonel, would you be willing to work with our military academies to develop new tactical doctrines? Webb nodded slowly. Commander, I'd be honored to teach the galaxy how to fight like humans, but I have to warn you about something first. What's that, sir? Webb's expression grew serious again. Once you learn to fight the way we do, you can never go back to believing that warfare is civilized. You'll understand what humans have always known, that when survival is at stake, the only rule is that there are no rules. He looked around the hall one final time. The truth is, Commander, we didn't become civilized despite our history of endless warfare. We became civilized because of it. When you've seen what intelligent beings can do to each other when everything is on the line, peace becomes infinitely precious. Commander Chen stood silently for a long moment, processing everything that had happened. The galaxy's greatest military minds had been defeated by an enemy that could think. But one human, using tactics that made no logical sense, had turned the tide of battle. Finally, she spoke, and her voice carried clearly through the quiet hall. Colonel Webb, what does humanity need from us?